All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name's Rolf Goddard. I also go by Rusty, and I've been wanting to give this talk for a couple of years. I gave a talk actually in 2022, I believe, about the Russo-Ukrainian War, which was still very fresh in our minds. And after that talk, which I focused on like the war thus far and how we got there, I realized that I really wanted to focus on the historical problems and how we got to that point, because I feel that the historical problems help us understand the political crises that we're experiencing right now. And so that's what this talk was about. And before I dive into some of the content, I just want to also give a plug for this QR code up here on the screen. Take out your phone and scan that. You're going to find a curated list of helpful resources that I put together, some books, some like documentaries, some websites, some really helpful resources to give some further reading to this conflict and how we got to this point. Because it's honestly, I'm not going to be able to do it justice in just about 60 minutes. So I thought for the purposes of our talk today, since this month marks the 3-year remembrance of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and 11 years since the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of Eastern Ukraine, I would create a fixed question and answer format to explore some common questions that have come up about the conflict and also the historical problems that have brought us to this point. But I want to also encourage you as attendees, if you have any questions, to hold those till the end. And I would love to have like a Q&A session at the end if you have any questions or any comments. And yeah, I'd love to help out as best I can. You know, my training is really as a historian. I can tell you much about the past. I can't really prognosticate much about the future, but the past informs the present. And so maybe between all of us together, we can kind of try to see what we think. So here are some of the common questions that I've kind of put together. The first one is, doesn't Ukraine belong to Russia? Not many people believe this in the United States, but some actually have kind of had this lingering background thought about that. And then second, aren't Russia's worries of NATO enlargement valid? The third one is, why is Crimea and Eastern Ukraine so contested? And then I decided for the purposes of our time, I actually presented on this during the Flex presentation in January, but because today's a little shorter, the question is Ukraine's government really fascist, a claim actually sometimes by the Russian government. It's just not true. And I think it's something that we don't really need to spend our time focusing on today. If anyone wants to ask this question in the Q&A session or even talk to me later on, I'd be happy to answer it, of course. And then number 5, like, doesn't some of this conflict have to deal with natural gas and oil? And then 6, what about Sacramento, right? How has the conflict affected the Slavic population of Sacramento? What are people doing about it? The first couple of questions are going to be probably the longest, and then the latter questions will be a little quicker. So if it seems like we're spending a lot of time on those first two, it's intentional. So our first question, doesn't Ukraine belong to Russia? How has Ukraine's history, right, under the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, how has that shaped its modern identity and its struggle for independence? So while this conflict is relatively recent and ongoing, the overall mentality of Russian elites that Ukraine must be or should be subservient to Russia, it goes back centuries. The Russian president Vladimir Putin himself actually sees this as a historical issue, and much of the present conflict can be considered the continued fallout of empire following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So the territory that is now Ukraine spent centuries under the Russian Empire, practically since the founding of the empire under Peter the Great in the 1700s. And following the Russian Empire's collapse in 1917, so I kind of gave you bookends there, from 1700 to like 1917, Ukraine experienced this brief moment of autonomy that was followed by German invasion and eventually Soviet control in the 1920s. Now, no doubt, right, that prolonged Russian presence in the region has greatly shaped Ukraine's modern identity. However, over the past few centuries, Ukraine's really developed its own unique cultural, political, religious, and linguistic identity And Russian elites, frankly, have really wrestled with this. In the 19th century historians like Vasily Kluchevsky, they propagated the idea that the gathering of Slavic peoples under Russian control was the quintessential feature of Russia's historical development following rule by the Mongols. Like, just to put that into perspective, like, some people look at westward expansion and manifest destiny as like this quintessential feature of the of America's formation, right? But key historians like Kluchevsky saw the gathering of Slavic peoples as Russia's key formation and its historical identity. Now, later on in the century, imperial administrators like Sergei Uvarov, who worked under Tsar Nicholas I, they intentionally shaped Kluchevsky's ideas into policy for the government, and really tried to act this out through policies like Russification, which was the spreading of Russian ideas and sometimes even the forceful extinction of other native languages to promote Russian. At roughly the same time that this is going on, that Russia is pursuing this gathering of Slavic peoples, this Russification policy, Kievan intellectuals, led by Mikhail Kostomarov and Taras Shevchenko, and really many others, championed a separate national identity for Ukraine. Adding to Russia's troubles was not just Ukrainian nationalism, but also Polish nationalism. And the Polish uprising in particular in 1863 to 1864, which really put a hamper on pan-Slavic sentiments, like uniting all the Slavic peoples. And it caused Russian officials and intellectuals to really scratch their heads to reimagine the relationship by suggesting instead that if all the Slavic peoples are not the same, then instead there must be these separate tribes. Great Russians, who these Russian intellectuals considered to be Russians, Little Russians, whom they considered to be Ukrainians, and White Russians, which is actually where we get the term Belarusian today for Belarusia. So all of these people were considered to be a part of a Slavic core, and then of course there were other Slavic peoples outside of that, but at least in Russia's eyes, the Slavic core was most important. Now, while this idea of like tribal identities within a greater Slavic core seems really benign at first glance, there was never any question, right, that Slavic brotherhood would be dominated by Russia and policies like Russification. And protecting and preserving that Russian-led Slavic unity was actually a primary goal of the Tsarist regime all the way up until World War I. Matter of fact, it's even one of the causes of World War I if you consider Russia's desire to protect a little Slavic brother in the Balkans like Serbia and the extent that it was willing to go for that. So after, or like, yeah, I would say during the war, during World War I, in 1917, right, the February Revolution, the Russian Empire collapses, the Tsar abdicates. This spurred some of those nationalist movements among its former territories. And in May, the Central Rada, that is the main legislative body in Ukraine, the Central Rada in Kiev, led by Mikhail Khrushchevsky, declared Ukraine to be an independent, autonomous region within a future Russian republic. Not knowing exactly what was going to happen out of all of this, that's what he envisioned at least. However, after the Bolsheviks took control in October, that like changed things. The Ukrainians were not in favor, at least these Ukrainian nationalists were not in favor of joining the Bolsheviks. Lenin and the Bolsheviks created a new Soviet state with equal socialist republics. But just prior to that, like Ukraine ended up during that short period of time before the Soviet Union actually like won in the Civil War, Ukraine felt that it had to align itself with anti-Bolshevik forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary to try to maintain its independence. So again, following that Civil War, Lenin and the Bolsheviks create this new Soviet state with equal socialist republics like Ukraine, Georgia, and so on. When we fast forward to present, it's really this moment in history that Ukraine that Vladimir Putin sees Ukraine as an artificial creation to maintain the imperial territories of the former Russian Empire. But I would argue, like, frankly, it really ignores the pre-existing nationalism in places like Ukraine and Georgia and Finland and elsewhere that existed like in the 19th century to lead us to this point. So when Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin and the then Commissar of Nationalities, Joseph Stalin, when they got together to try to like think about the formation of the Soviet Union, among other peoples, right, they were basically sanctioning what was already there by creating Ukraine. Lenin and others really recognized that Ukraine had become so distinct that its autonomy could no longer be denied if it were to be retained at all within the new Soviet framework. So this leads us really to, I argue, a flawed understanding of history, right? While early Soviet leaders seem to have recognized Ukraine's national identity, like Lenin and even to some extent Stalin, at least in the early years, Vladimir Putin, I'm sorry, seems to have missed it entirely. His tragically flawed misunderstanding of history is what has really fueled this present conflict and is best seen through his July 2021 article titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." And just flat out, the title on the historical unity is deliberately misleading because it presupposes unity among Slavic peoples has always existed, and by which they mean Russian-led Slavic unity. In it, Putin claims that the Russians and Ukrainians, as you can see there, as I boxed it off here, were one people, a single whole. He also claims that there had been these forces, right? The fragmentation that we see is the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. The formula they applied has been known from time immemorial, right? He says divide and rule. No doubt a reference actually to the West and the NATO alliance. The article even goes on to talk about language differences or language similarities. And he's talking, of course, about Russian and Ukrainian, in addition to the supposed unity of the Russian Orthodox faith, while admitting that, quote, many centuries of fragmentation and living within different states naturally brought about regional language. He uses the word peculiarities, resulting in the emergence of dialects. Again, this largely downplays the historical complexities and diversity of experiences in both Ukraine and Russia. I just want to say languages are complex. They change over time. What may seem static is actually something that's not. It's flowing and changing and shaping, just like the English language or any other language might change and shape over time. But to Russian elites, right, Ukrainian is not a language. Instead, they balk at that and they say that it's, you know, just like a, it's not. I wanted to talk just a little bit about Ukrainian Orthodox autocephaly, but I will just, you know, to try for the purposes of our time today, I would just say that when Ukraine broke away from the Russian Orthodox Church, it was the same movement toward Ukrainian independence as we see within language and culture and nationality too. So the fact that religion is also playing a part in all of this is really quite understandable. Perhaps the most defining moment, though, if we're to think about, you know, this question, does Ukraine belong to Russia? The most defining moment in modern historical memory that has driven a wedge in Slavic unity was the 1932 and 33 Holodomor. Soviet officials under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, then leader of the Soviet Union, and Lazar Kaganovich, who was in charge of implementing these plans and collectivization in Ukraine, they intentionally exported grain to bring about the conditions of a famine to break Ukrainian resistance to those collectivization efforts. It's estimated that some 5 million Ukrainians died between 1931 and 34 because of hunger. Now, while scholars debate whether the event was truly a genocide or not, the Ukrainian parliament in 2006 has declared it as such. They've declared it a genocide. And recent scholarship seems to have coalesced around the fact that while it was a human engineered event, or I'm sorry, they seem to have coalesced around the fact that it is a human engineered event that targeted Ukrainian identity specifically. And really, this deep scar, which has marred Russian-Ukrainian relations ever since, has not healed over and has fueled the present conflict even to this day. So that was question one. That's a lengthy introduction, but honestly, I wanted the history to take center stage here as we're talking about the historical problems as to how we got to this point. What I'd like to do now is talk about a much more recent history and talk about Russia's worries of NATO enlargement. Also, I want to talk about what role has the dissolution of the Soviet Union and post-Cold War post-Cold War geopolitics, like not only NATO, but also EU expansion and so on, played in escalating tensions. So let's turn our attention now to talking about a much more modern history and how we got to this point, not just like a Russian mentality. So another historical aspect that's really gained considerable attention considering the war between Russia and Ukraine is this geopolitical fault line between East and West. Along with this are Russia's concerns about losing Ukraine and both countries' security concerns regarding NATO expansion, which is really going to be first and foremost in the talks that are going to be happening here soon between the United States, the bilateral talks between the United States and Russia. And of course, along with this are Ukraine's desires to be a part of the European Union. That plays into this calculus. Ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has really sought to preserve any remaining influence over what it terms its near abroad. That is the term Russia used to explain basically its neighbors and also former countries of the countries of the former Soviet Empire. The very first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, he saw NATO expansion as a threat to Russia, and his successor, Vladimir Putin, has felt very similarly. In an often quoted remark from a 2005 State of the Nation address, Putin remarked, and you probably know this if you have been following the news and you've been following what kinds of things Vladimir Putin says. He once remarked that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, referring to the 20th century. What's often not quoted is what he stated immediately after that. And I think it's really telling. He said this, he said, quote, "And for the Russian people, it was a real drama. Tens of millions of our citizens and fellow countrymen found themselves outside the Russian Federation." By this, he meant that he did not wish to resurrect the Soviet Union, as some thought in those early days, but instead that the Russian Federation did not encompass all of the various Russian peoples that he thought belonged in Russia. Now, whatever the thoughts and desires of the local inhabitants, like whether we're talking Ukraine, whether we're talking like Finland, whether we're talking like, various different borderland regions along Russia's border today, it was Putin's desire to incorporate these people into a larger Russian framework. And now we know that was more akin to like a resurgence of the Russian Empire and the Russian imperial model than, say, like the Soviet model. But NATO has frustrated those efforts. And of course, the inhabitants seeking NATO membership have been first and foremost in that. So whereas there used to be this buffer zone between Russia and the NATO alliance, the border now runs like a fault line between Russia and Eastern Europe, with nearly every European nation except Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia now holding NATO membership. Those last two, Ukraine and Georgia, actually they're aspirants. They want to be, but they might not be. It depends on where the talks go. Again, channeling history but for his own political machinations, Putin and his press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, have looked to the alleged promise by US Secretary of State James Baker to Mikhail Gorbachev back in February 1990, right, when the Soviet Union was not yet collapsing, but almost there. That if the Soviet Union were to guarantee a united Germany within NATO, when Germany was fragmented during the Cold War, but then unifying after the 1989 revolutions, if the Soviet Union were to guarantee a united Germany within NATO, the military alliance, NATO, in his words, quote, would not expand 1 inch eastward, All right, so this is a phrase that Putin has really kind of brought up time and time again to say, hey, wait a second, we were promised this. And to talk about this, I'd really like to show this clip from Mary Elise Sorote, who is a historian at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. She does a good job of clarifying that Baker's remark as Secretary of State to Gorbachev was not really intended as a formal promise, though Gorbachev perceived it as such. German leader Helmut Kohl further reinforced this perception by relying on Baker's version of the talks rather than President George H.W. Bush's stance. And that left Gorbachev mistakenly confident that the NATO expansion was off the table, despite no formal agreement had been made about that. So this video is probably about maybe 4 minutes or so. And so I just want to show this to you. I think she does a good job of explaining this. Okay. Yeah, let's see if I can get that. Looks like I need to share audio. Hold on, everybody. 1 second. And yeah, let's see. So if I do this, Pro speaker, no. Okay. Okay, so let's do this. Oh yeah, it's been so long. Okay, here we go. Got it. Yes. Let me back that up real quick. So let's go back. And
indeed been an explicit agreement not to expand. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to expand this session by another 3 hours, right? Everybody, are you hopefully you're sitting comfortably?
I'll give you 2.
Because you know, I mean, we're literally at time right now, and those are 2 huge questions. So I will basically try to gallop through an answer, but I can only say that I really go into this in detail in the book. So for context, you know, the whole debate over this question is whether or not there was a betrayal, right? And if you imagine a spectrum, on one end is the hardline American view. It never came up. It's a myth. The Russians are crazy. And on the other hand is the really hardline Russian view. We were absolutely betrayed, 100%, no doubt about it. And I can tell you, as someone who's looked at this on the basis of 2 decades of getting documents declassified, that neither of those are accurate. Right? As is so often the case, what happened, the narrative of events shows that what happened was somewhere in between. And so the question is where? And I think it is justified to focus on this question because it is, one of the factors that drove the disintegration in relations between the U.S. and Russia, which I think is the great tragedy of our age, right? And again, because they are the 2 countries that control 90% of the nuclear warheads in the world. And if they are at odds with each other and there are threats of nuclear war, as there are again, that would be the end of civilization on our planet. I don't think there is anything more important than that. That's why I work on it. So given that this is such an issue of conflict, this is, one of the justifications Putin is using for the massive bloodshed in Ukraine, I think it's important to understand as a scholar, based on evidence, what happened. That's why it was so important to me that it be reproducible, right? So if you go back to the spectrum where you have, at one hand, you have the Americans saying it never came up, a total myth, and you have the Russians saying it, it was absolutely betrayal, and you realize neither of those work. So this would happen to me. I would do interviews. So I would press Americans and say, well, that's not accurate. I have all these documents where James Baker is saying to Mikhail Gorbachev, how about we talk about NATO not enlarging 1 inch eastward? For context, this is happening as part of German unification. And the reason this is happening is that even though the Soviet Union is weak and falling apart, with regard to divided Germany, it has 2 strong cards. It has nearly 400,000 troops in East Germany, and it has unlimited, unconditional legal rights over Germany coming out of World War II. When Nazi Germany surrendered in 1945, it surrendered unconditionally. Bedingungslose Kapitulation. No end line, no deadline, no nothing. So in order for Germany to unify, Moscow has to be convinced to give up both its troops and its undisputed legal rights. And so the question is, what will Moscow want in exchange? And so speculatively, and this goes to your point, Alexander of Deutsche Welle, at one point speculatively, Baker says to, as an early negotiation round, where you're, ein Sondierungsgespräch, where you're just trying to figure out positions. Baker says, well, how about this? How about we talk about maybe saying NATO won't move 1 inch eastward in exchange for you letting Germany unify? And Gorbachev says, yes, we could work on that. Baker goes back home to his boss and friend, George H.W. Bush, and Bush says, Jim, that was a mistake. We don't need to argue about the future of NATO. I'm George H.W. Bush. As I say about myself, I don't do the vision thing, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I, President Bush, think that NATO just won the Cold War. Why, for God's sake, should I negotiate about its future? We're not going to do that. You need to cut this off. So Baker, this is one of my archival discoveries, Baker wrote back to the German Foreign Ministry and said, I'm very sorry, we need to stop talking about this. I've caused confusion. This is not actually our negotiating position. It took Moscow a while to notice, and the West German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, ignored this letter and kept talking about it, because he thought it, was going to be necessary. So clearly it came up, but it was a confused moment, and then the West stepped back from that. There was also discussion early on about Central and Eastern Europe. So if you take these two extremes, it's clear it came up, it's clear it was discussed, but it got brushed aside. And then what happens at the end in the treaty is that instead of giving up its rights for promises about NATO, Moscow gives up its rights with regard to Germany for cash. The treaty does not prohibit NATO expansion. There is no, I don't like the word promise because that's a psychological term. Different people can understand different things in it. When you look at the treaty allows NATO to move eastward, and to repeat, Moscow signed and ratified this treaty and cashed the associated check. Now, the Russian position is, if you can, obviously I can't go to Russia anymore, but when I used to go there and I would talk to Russians, I would say, okay, this is not accurate, that you were totally betrayed. This treaty exists. And they would say, sort of privately, okay, you have a point. But James Baker, the best friend of the president, looked Mikhail Gorbachev in the eye and talked about NATO moving not 1 inch eastward. So that's kind of a gentleman's agreement. That is consistent with the evidence, right? So these two statements are consistent with evidence. The conversation took place, but what is in the treaty is different. And where I ultimately came down as a scholar is that what is in the treaty that matters, right? This was not a case of somebody forgetting to write something down. This was the big time, right? This was the end of the division of Germany, the end of the Cold War, in a certain sense, the end of the Second World War, right? The stakes could not have been higher. The people involved in this were pros. The Soviet diplomats were pros. James Baker was a pro. This was the biggest of big times. And, it was really a hard negotiation, and what matters is what's in the treaty. And the treaty, black and white, allows NATO to enlarge.
Yeah, so as you saw there in the video, just to kind of like recap a little bit, she's clarifying again, Baker's remark was not intended as a formal promise. Though Gorbachev perceived it as such. German leader Helmut Kohl, who's desirous of this unification of Germany, further reinforced the perception by relying on Baker's version of the talks rather than George H.W. Bush's. But then George H.W. Bush wants to reel back from that, which left Gorbachev mistakenly confident that NATO expansion was off the table, despite no formal agreement being made. I appreciate that Sorote actually, in the video, recognizes mutual misunderstandings, which I think can happen quite a bit in talks like this. And my worries for the current talks that are to come here soon is that the current negotiations taking place really might create similar misunderstandings. And the people involved, I know, at least on the Russian side, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who has been foreign minister since 2004, and Putin, who has been president since 2000, they're veterans. They have years of experience in the office, and they thrive off of frozen conflicts. And they've really been able to negotiate some really favorable treaties for Russia at the expense of other nations. And so the fears that Ukraine might not be there, that similar misunderstandings might take place, I think is really, it's worrisome given the historical context of it. Now, while a lot of people focus and think about NATO, something that actually Ukrainians know full well. Hold on, I'm going to cough. Something Ukrainians know full well and actually bring up sometimes is the Budapest Memorandum, right? Tangled up with all of the talks about how to unify Germany, how to, how the Soviet Union was dissolving, were fears about like nuclear weapons. And so non-proliferation talks between the United States and Russia and even Ukraine were taking place in the early 1990s. The Budapest Memorandum emerged from US and Russian efforts to prevent nuclear weapons from falling into dangerous hands. And the US really pushed Ukraine, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan, to sign the 1992 Lisbon Protocol and to commit to becoming non-nuclear states. Now, initially hesitant, Ukraine was eventually made to, Ukraine eventually agreed, not made to, but Ukraine eventually agreed after the US promised compensation. Remember in the early 1990s that Ukraine's economy was in free fall, much like Russia was. And so the promised compensation for its nuclear arsenal and also Russia and the United States pledging to supply nuclear energy from the dismantled warheads was enough to get them to sign that Lisbon Protocol. And then 2 years later in December, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma signed the Budapest Memorandum with signatories, including the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, and also France, all of them promising to respect the independence and sovereignty basically of the existing borders of Ukraine and to refrain from the threat or use of force against its territorial integrity. However, while that sounds really pretty watertight, right, as Serhiy Plokhy, director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, has observed, the memorandum really lacked commitments to protect Ukraine. And if these promises were ever violated. Now, the mood of the 1990s was not intensely confrontational between Russia and Ukraine then. Ukraine, nevertheless, entered the new millennium with no nuclear deterrent, and understandably, it sought more concrete assurances. So hence, it sought protection through things like NATO and the European Union. So then what really explains NATO expansion eastward? And I would just say, simply put, Russia's actions explain it. The 1999 admission of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary stemmed largely from Russian aggression in Chechnya. By 2004, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and several Balkan states joined NATO after Russian troops withdrew in the 1990s. And surprisingly, this actually caused very little conflict, as post 9/11 relations between the United States and Russia were relatively amicable. But like when asked in an interview in November 2001, NPR's Robert Siegel, if you remember him being an anchor on NPR back then, he was doing a Q&A where Americans could ask the new Russian president questions. And Putin was put to the question whether or not he would oppose the admission of Baltic states into NATO, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Putin replied at first that it was an issue that, quote, could not be summed up easily with a yes or no, but he acknowledged that we cannot forbid people to make certain choices if they want to increase the security of their nations in a particular way. Now, like the 1990s, the early 2000s reflected a less adversarial mood, while NATO's growth faced minimal resistance from Russia. But today, there are now 32 nations that are NATO members, and the most recent additions of Finland, which took place in April 2023, and Sweden in March of last year, are helpful in recognizing how NATO enlargement has actually taken place. Both countries throughout much of the Cold War were diplomatically neutral and would have remained so had Russia not invaded Crimea in 2014 and carried out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The year 2014 was a major turning point, with many NATO countries actually beginning to spend more on defense, and 2022 really driving increased military spending. Right, this has been something that President Trump has had on his list for a long time. He's felt that NATO countries don't spend their fair share, but actually in recent years they have spent They have done exactly that. A mid-2024 NATO report revealed that NATO members now spend a median of 2.11% of their GDP on defense, with some countries like Estonia spending 3.43 and Poland topping the list with 4.12% of their GDP on defense, exceeding the NATO 2% commitment. Now, additionally, the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he sees NATO membership for Ukraine as the path to victory and the only means currently by which Ukraine can avoid a frozen conflict and or trade-offs involving territory or sovereignty. Like so many other nations before it, Ukraine desires NATO membership as a deterrent to Russian aggression. And instead of viewing the NATO border expanding eastward, I firmly believe it's more accurate to view Eastern European nations desiring to be within the NATO bloc to the west. Now, not just NATO, we also need to take into consideration its EU aspirations. And throughout Ukraine's history, there's been strong public support for joining the European Union, highlighted by the 2004 Orange Revolution depicted there on the left-hand side, and the 2014 Maidan, Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity protests. In 2014, protests erupted after President Viktor Yanukovych rejected closer ties with the European Union in favor of Russia. And this actually was widely unpopular. It led to his ousting after a violent crackdown on people. Ukraine's assertion of independence, despite limited US support at that time, fueled the Kremlin's worst fears that they were going to lose influence over the country. And shortly after the Sochi Olympics, Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatists in the Donbas region to the east to thwart Ukraine's European aspirations. And so this leads us to our third question, which is, why is Crimea and Eastern Ukraine so contested? Why do we talk about these two regions so much when we talk about the conflict? So the historical and cultural makeup, right, of these regions matters a great deal when talking about this conflict. And again, it's tempting to look at Vladimir Putin's announcement of a military operation in Ukraine on February 22nd, 2022, as the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Really, for Ukrainians and the inhabitants of the Crimea and the Donbas, that war started 10 years earlier in February 2014, with the seizure of Crimea being the first land grab in Europe since the Second World War. Crimea has long been a prize of Russian imperialists and Soviet vacationers. And for much of its time in the Soviet Union, it belonged to the RSFSR, that is the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, if you will. However, following the purges of the 1940s, many of the Crimean Tatars, the native inhabitants of the region, were forcibly exiled to Central Asia. And the region began to fall behind economically and fail exceptionally to meet its grain quotas. So to remedy this problem, Nikita Khrushchev actually transferred the region to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union, to better meet those production quotas. And this made much more geographic and economic sense, since the Kerch Strait, which is depicted here on the right-hand side, was the only means by which the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic could get to this part, to get to Crimea, because this part was actually occupied or controlled by the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union. But it also probably helped that Khrushchev was the former first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union of Ukraine before becoming the leader of the Soviet Union in its entirety. And also, we should keep in mind contextually that the socialists, the Soviet Socialist republics, between them, territorial disputes did not really matter much during the Soviet period. It was much less of a concern of border changes inside than, say, outside of the Soviet Union. The region's population in both Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine tends to skew ethnically Russian, or at least linguistically Russian. And it has done so since the Tatars' displacement in the 1940s. But even still, those Russian-speaking peoples have coexisted peacefully within Ukraine until the Soviet Union's dissolution. When, in particular, when Russian-backed President Viktor Yanukovych fled Kyiv during the 2014 Maidan protests, Putin capitalized on the chaos and he annexed Crimea, and that left Yanukovych unable to escape. He basically was unable to escape via Donetsk or Crimea. He was eventually taken by helicopter to Russia, where he remains to this day. Now, we should also keep in mind that when we look at various regions and we think about the economic concerns, Eastern Ukraine has a long entangled past with Russia, and the Donbas region of Donetsk and Luhansk, this is Donetsk here, this is Luhansk. It was traditionally an industrial coal mining and steel producing base during the Soviet period, and it attracted a lot of Russians, but it has lately turned into a rust belt with high levels of unemployment. And while the spoken language there and in the south of Ukraine, again, is primarily Russian, surveys collected in 2013, 2015, and 2017 by the University of St. Gallen show that residents there have historically identified as Ukrainian. And so even though they linguistically speak Russian, they have preferred to be within a Russian state, within a Ukrainian state, than say within a Russian one, at least when they have the chance to say that. This was taken in 2015. This is from the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, courtesy of the Brookings Institution. You can see here, it is a slim majority, of course, 51.9 and 52.2. But as of 2015, after the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the destabilization of Eastern Ukraine, many of those individuals living in that region actually were still preferring to be within a Ukrainian state. Now, Putin's government has attempted to really play up the ethnic and linguistic differences by claiming that these Russian-speaking peoples have been mistreated by the government in Kyiv, kind of like Hitler did about the Sudetenland Germans just prior to annexing Czechoslovakia in the late 30s. But those claims are just simply not true. And still, the Kremlin has gone on, and they have these visions of what's called New Russia or Novorossiya. This is something that they put out on the 30th of September. It says Dien Vosoyedenia, which is the day of reunification of Donbass and New Russia, Novorossiya Sarossiya, like a new Russia with Russia. This region, of course, the eastern part of Ukraine, of the Donetsk region, being what they're terming to be New Russia. And then below it says Одна страна, одна семья, одна Россия. In other words, one country, one family, one Russia. And so this has really inspired many, like in the 90s, like these ideas of Russia and Ukraine uniting inspired Russian imperialists like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but also people currently like the Eurasianist Alexander Dugin, who has also been very excited about these efforts. Not long after the February 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russian paramilitary units under the command of nationalists like Igor Girkin, a former FSB agent, they were active in the destabilization of the Donbas region and creating Donetsk and Luhansk, these people's republic that Russia was propping up. And while Russia funded and supported these efforts, they also did not have complete control over them, and there tended to be a lot of chaos and uncontrollable events that ensued. Like you might recall, a few years ago, there was a Malaysian Airlines flight called Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 that was shot down over Kyiv, and for a while it was unsure exactly who did it. But we now have good evidence and reason to believe that actually it was one of Igor Girkin's militia groups that was responsible. So in short, following the failed attempts to keep Ukraine within Russia's orbit, it follows that the next best alternative probably would have been, at least in the minds of the Russian leadership, to destabilize the two largest Russian-speaking regions with Ukraine in order to slow its westward movement toward the EU and toward NATO. So I said I was going to skip over this part. And again, if you have questions about this, we could talk about this later. The question about, does some of this conflict have to deal with natural gas and oil? And the answer is quite literally yes. it has fueled the conflict. The natural gas side of things, there has been a long and complex relationship in the post-Soviet period between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's energy grid basically was created by the Soviet Union, so they're linked together. Natural gas has been critical for heating in Western Ukraine and Europe primarily, and that flows primarily through Ukrainian pipelines. And now Russia has leveraged that dependency of Ukraine on Russian gas by cutting off gas supplies during the winters, notably after the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2014 Maidan protests is when they really tried to shut it off. And in the 2010s, Russia sought to bypass Ukraine with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Germany. But the 2014 Crimean invasion really changed all of that. Germany, which was like, really seeking a means to try to get gas around Ukraine, realized after 2014 that they started to distance themselves from Russia and from Russian gas. And currently the pipeline Nord Stream 2 is inoperable, halted by German policy, but also because of Ukrainian sabotage as well. Very quickly, with regard to oil, Russia has long been an oil producing state whose net worth has been tied to the price of petroleum. And this especially became true after Putin brought several oil and natural gas companies like Rosneft and Gazprom under the control of the government in the early 2000s. And when energy prices were soaring in 2008, this enabled the Russian government to fetch a high price for oil and to increase its internal cash reserves. And this is one of the primary reasons why Russia has survived so many years of sanctions. Also, Russia has found clever ways to get around the sanctions that are really too lengthy to describe here, but things like selling oil on the black market, changing oil tanker ship labeling, funneling it through a third party or a third country. They've done a number of creative things to do this. An August 2024 Economist article, though, predicted that Russia's reserves, though, will run out in 5 years. And at some point, they will need to come to terms with all the deficit spending. But a lot can change in 5 years. And just really briefly, anecdotally, a friend of mine who lives in Arkhangelsk, she and I were messaging, and I had mentioned to her, how are prices? How are things looking? What's the economy look like there? And she said, oh, thank goodness. I bought my house last year and I managed to secure a 15% interest rate, right, for her mortgage. And I was like, oh, really? What was it? Or what's it now? And she said, now it's like around 20, 21%, an astronomical amount. And so her feeling good about that with a 15%, right, mortgage interest rate was really just kind of shocking and eye-opening to me that Russians are really paying the price. And it may not seem that way from the outside, but on the inside, there's definitely cracks that are showing, and their central bank will probably have to give in at some point. The last question is really just pure joy. I think it's fun to talk about and to think about how our own Slavic community has reacted to this. And Slavic immigrants have been coming to Sacramento since at least 1917, perhaps even earlier. With successive waves after things like the Holodomor in the 30s and the Soviet Union in the 90s. And there are about 100,000 Slavic immigrants living in the area today. The Sacramento as a city, as a metropolitan area, actually boasts the distinction of being the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. That's significant, and I think informs our teaching here in the Sacramento area. Whereas one might think that actually the war would have split the Slavic community along Russian and Ukrainian lines. In fact, it's actually strengthened it as a result of both Russian exiles and Ukrainian immigrants have found common ground in their dislike for Russia's current government and its crackdown on civil liberties and the freedom of expression. Local churches in the area hold services in both Russian and Ukrainian. Sometimes in a particular church, it might be simultaneously. They'll sing one song in Russian, another in Ukrainian. Translations, right, might be Russian and Ukrainian side by side. Groups like the Sunflower Society of Sacramento, which was run in part by a former ARC student, Elena Avtuk, right, organize monthly protests at the Capitol, and they gain the attention of local legislators and work alongside collectives and raise money to support Ukraine. Additionally, there's festivals like the Yarmulke Festival held at Southside Park to celebrate Slavic culture and help raise awareness for the Ukrainian war effort. And like anyone interested in these kinds of things, I can definitely turn you on to some of the publications in the area, like the Diaspora magazine or Etna Radio on 87.7. But they're alive and well and not, I imagine there's probably some hurt that exists. But when we look at the community as a whole, the fragmentation that could be there is not. So just real quickly in conclusion, I firmly believe that historical problems they deserve historical context. And the reason I've taken the pains to kind of share all this with you is that I believe that this war has deep historical roots, and it's important that we recognize them. And in order to better understand the community and our Slavic neighbors who we live alongside, especially given ARC's proximity to the Sacramento Slavic population and the students that we serve. The second one is that I think that this conflict has really been long and protracted. It may very well continue even past the potential ceasefire or peace agreement. It may very well be America's desires, and I understand it completely. We have spent like some 60-some billion dollars. I think the last estimate I read from the State Department was $69 billion, right, to Ukraine since 2022. That's a heavy price tag, and it's a burden on taxpayers. However, the desire for us to get out and to get out quickly, I think, will only create similar situations that we've had in the past where we have promised things and aggression has taken place because of our lack of enforcement or follow through. As a fellow democratic nation, I think America should frankly care about Ukraine, if not for its own sake, at least for the sake of the world order, which we might be destabilizing if we're not careful. And Putin's idea that it's legitimate to invade other countries is just flat out wrong. It violates international borders, international agreements, since like the UN Charter to the Budapest Memorandum to the recent Minsk agreements. And lastly, the truth matters. So I hope, and just, looking at these things and researching these things, you come to learn more about it for yourself. And I think that's why we do this. That's why we care. So thank you so much. I didn't leave enough time for questions and answers, but let's do it. What would be some questions that we have? And let me actually go back to, I'm going to put up on the screen the QR code in case people want to look at that as well. Let's do that. And yeah, so, okay, so Brenda, thank you for your comment. Yeah, important work. I agree. I'm glad you agree with me too. And then, yeah, thank you, Irina. Of course, I'd be happy to, if I ever do another talk like this, you and I should get in touch so that we can share it out more broadly.
I would like to thank you all for this presentation. In general, as Ukrainian, I can confirm all the facts that you've mentioned. It is really important to work with this Russian propaganda. It's very important to have such meetings to show people what is really happening. Like, it's need to change because, like, unfortunately, a lot of misleadings goes through, like, even news. And I really appreciate you for everything what you do. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And it's my pleasure. Things happen so fast that it seems that we as a society have a short memory. We forget, and maybe that forgetting is sometimes intentional and sometimes not intentional, but it's hard to keep up with all of the events and all the things that are going on, or all the things that maybe are being messaged, sometimes by the Kremlin, sometimes by us. But it's also really important to ground ourselves in the history of this time. And so, yeah, my pleasure. There's a question, I think, about, okay, I don't know that question. I thought I saw a question briefly about the nuclear element, but then I think that went away. I don't know. And anyone else? I mean, you could certainly unmute yourself and I'd be happy to hear you out.
Oh, hey, Rusty, I did have a question about the nuclear element, if you wanted to address that.
Yeah. Please.
What do you think that's one of my biggest concerns is just going toe to toe with two nuclear powers.
Yeah.
And what do you think about Putin's intentions with strategic?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I want to be careful in what I'm saying here because it's easy for me to sit in a chair and to like pontificate what I think might happen as opposed to real events that might occur. My own understanding of how Putin has messaged that in the past has usually been saber rattling. He has really tried to, when there has been moments that he's been really upset about, it seems that there have been comments about, he's basically made comments to the effect that we have this nuclear arsenal, we're not afraid to use it. And that's true. I mean, Russia is, the United States and Russia have the most nuclear warheads in the world. And we need to never forget that. And that's why I think, honestly, on the relations between the two countries could stand to get better. I know for some, the talks between Trump and Putin have been disparaging. And initially, I thought so too. However, I think it could also be us normalizing talks could be a good thing if those bilateral talks also include Ukraine as well. But to speak more to the nuclear element of it, I think Putin uses that to his advantage, that and to scare us off, because the more he can scare us off from protecting our allies, the easier he will have a time of dividing and splitting up the continent. And his spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has mentioned this as well, and I think they use that to their advantage, and so hard to say. Yep. Alice asked a good question. Let's see. Okay, so Alice, I'm just going to read your question out loud. You said, do you view Putin's tragically flawed view as ignorant or purposeful to further his desires of empire building, expanding what he considers the Russian peoples in his near abroad? Yeah, that's a great question. I've really tried to take a lot of time to try to understand what he meant through documents like that. I think, honestly, Putin, who has taken up history as a hobby, a dangerous hobby for us, I think he sincerely believes it. And there have been a number of people within Russian imperial history that he looks to, like Antonin Denikin, who was a white general in the Russian Civil War, and others. And so he's getting these bits of information from parts of history that kind of reinforce his opinion about Slavic peoples, but they're really incorrect. As much as I admire Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right? He was an amazing figure and an amazing dissident. His own views have been also somewhat damaging in seeing Ukraine as really not different or distinct from Russia. And so also too, Putin has really taken up some of those ideas as well. And if you're interested in that, I can share with you a pamphlet that Solzhenitsyn wrote in the 90s that kind of talks about
that. I'd love to have a copy of that. Thanks.
Yeah, of course, Alice. I know where you are on Wednesday, so I'll get you.
Are you going to be sharing this recording?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
good.
I'll be sharing. I'm not quite sure what would be the most appropriate means of how to share it. Like, do I just like email blast everyone? But I definitely want to make sure people can watch and see this and share it large. So
great. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other last questions?
I had one more little addendum to my first question.
Oh yeah, let's look at that. You said read the talks. Do you think prognostication? Sorry, should we trust Putin? I tend to think that Putin actually negotiates out of a position of strength. When it's to his advantage, I think you can probably trust him. When it's well, I mean, I just think you have to be very careful, because I think he does not keep agreements, and so if it's to his advantage, he'll keep it. If it's not, then he won't. And really, I feel sad that we're talking about Russia. In talking about Russia, we're mainly talking about one person, right? We're not talking about Igor Girkin. We're not talking about Yevgeny Prigozhin, who died a few years ago. right, supporting the Putinist regime. We're not talking about any of these other elites. We're mainly talking about Putin because Russia really is a cult of personality leadership. And so I wish we could incorporate the Russian people more to a certain degree, but really it's us guessing what the man Vladimir Putin is going to be thinking. Camille.
Hey, Rusty, thank you for doing this. So
Yeah.
I'm not super informed about our current foreign policy, but just reading the headlines, it seems like United States has sort of forced an agreement from Ukraine that United States will get access to mineral rights in return for our continued support. If I understand that agreement correctly, how do you think that will affect Ukraine's ability to resist Russia right now? Like, just fortify them or weaken them?
I don't know. I can't imagine if we're to be military supporting them, like why would we extract revenue from one of their main revenue sources? That doesn't, to me, just at first glance, that doesn't seem super great. Also, that there would be these forceful like the way in which negotiations have happened, that Trump has said that he wants these bilateral agreements in Saudi Arabia with Putin, mano a mano, that would take place without Ukraine, and that there would be this discussion about also the mineral resources. It really sounds like the United States is setting the table for Ukraine to give things up prior to what even Russia has even said. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good at all. I think it's not it's not negotiating from a position of strength, but instead it's basically gaining concessions prior to the talk so that they become concrete. I will choose to keep a part of my mind open to the fact that these are just bilateral talks. They're just initial negotiations or talks between states, and that I hope, it seems like Emmanuel Macron has really tried to say that Ukraine needs to be a part of this and Zelensky needs to be a part of this. So maybe that day might come when it looks more multilateral. But at this point, I'm worried about how things are progressing.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And thank you for the workshop.
Yeah. Okay. Well, any of you, if you know me, you know how to get a hold of me. If you don't, I teach at American River College, and my email should probably be accessible from the website. And so if you have further questions you'd like to follow up about this, please do. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. But at any rate, thank you all for attending, and so good to see all of you today on a Thursday. So.